No. So yeah, these good things. So please welcome Mark Shuttleworth. Please give them strong applause. Thank you. Can you tell us how was it up there? I guess we forgot this to mention.
Sure, I'd be very happy to talk for a little bit about the great privilege of flying in space, as well as the great privilege of being part of what I think is a fundamental change in the technology landscape. What's the best way for us to conduct this? Should I speak for a little while and then should we take questions?
You can speak. We have slides for you, I hope.
Okay. And all right, and then we can just rotate the slides as we go.
And then we can have questions.
Sure.
And if you prefer a microphone, we can give you this one.
No, I'm comfortable.
Okay.
Thank you.
Would you prefer this?
No, don't worry about it. Right, good morning. It is a great privilege to be here, and I was very much enjoying listening to the opening speakers. I could understand a little bit of what was said because, well, 9 years ago, I learned a Slavic language, and I remember thinking of all the Slavic languages that they all share this characteristic of sort of delicacy, like ballet, mixed with testosterone and strength. And so, unfortunately, я still забыл, and so I'm afraid I'll have to speak in English, and I hope that that doesn't diminish our ability to exchange ideas. I'm happy to talk a little for a little while, and then also happy to take questions. I'm very interested in the things that you find interesting, and in how you see open source and free software defining your future and the future of your friends and colleagues and family members. So first, a little bit about space. It feels strange now, in fact, it feels like a little bit of a dream, in fact. It was always a dream from when I was a very young child. And in 2000, I found myself in a position to essentially tackle any project that I wanted. And it was very clear to me that there was one thing that I wanted to experience, I wanted to be part of, and that was manned spaceflight. Looking back, I think it was an extraordinary opportunity to dive into a completely different culture. And many of the friends that I made during that year are still friends today. I recently went back to Moscow for the 50th anniversary celebrations of Gagarin's first flight. And that was an opportunity to reconnect with many people there and also just to re-immerse myself in Star City and the sort of cosmonaut culture. When you see the world from a distance, you realize just how connected all of our various countries and cultures are. You see the world without borders, of course. And so you're very conscious of the fact that many of the things that occupy our newspapers and our headlines don't actually register for at a global scale. You also see visibly the problems that we're creating, pollution, environmental destruction. You really see those things when you look at the Earth from space. Here we can look up at the sky and sort of feel like there's an infinite amount of buffer between us and the rest of the world. We can perhaps imagine that there are huge parts of the Earth which are wilderness, safe places where diversity, eco-diversity, environmental diversity can be preserved. But in fact, when you see the Earth from space, you realize that the impact that we've had on the Earth is almost total. There are virtually no areas which are lush and green which aren't effectively cultivated. And problems created in one country very much flow over to another. So after that experience, I wanted to be part of something global. I wanted to be part of something that would have a global impact. And for me, that is what Ubuntu is all about. I also believe very much that no individual or company or project ultimately changes the world. Change is very much something of the times. And I think that Ubuntu is therefore really just the most visible part, I think, for many people, of what is an enormous shift. And that shift is powered by the thousands of free software community contributors that have nothing to do with Ubuntu, essentially, that often don't think of themselves as doing anything with Ubuntu. Underneath it all, of course, is this phenomenon of globalization and collaboration, the internet connecting people with common interests and allowing them to build beautiful and functional software together. And Ubuntu often gets the credit for the work of many thousands of people who, as I say, have nothing to do with Ubuntu. So when I talk about Ubuntu, I'm really talking about this movement towards collaboration and towards creating things together, towards attracting talent on the basis of interests rather than on the basis of geography. I think it's important to be clear about what one's interested in trying to achieve, and there are lots of reasons to get involved with free software. Some of those interests can be intensely personal. You might be particularly interested in music, and so you get drawn into a community of people who are building, shared software, open source software for music. Or you might be interested in, it might be a social thing for you. You might be just interested in meeting other people who have a similar way of seeing the world. For me, it's about bringing some of the extraordinary joy and potency and ability to innovate to a much larger community. When we started Ubuntu, free software was already well established. There were good companies doing good work around free software. If you were a technologist, you could use free software to do amazing things on the internet. Most of the big businesses, the most interesting brands created in technology in the last 10 years have all been powered by free software. eBay, Yahoo, Google, of course. These great companies were all built by people who knew how to take free software technology and put it together in new and innovative ways to create new businesses, new business models. So in many senses, by then, you could already declare free software a success for technologists. And so the first thing I think that I thought we could do differently is expand our definition of success from helping technologists and providing a platform for technologists to helping and providing a platform for a much bigger group of people, a group of people that don't think of themselves as developers or technologists or system administrators or even entrepreneurs and innovators. They're simply people who want to use computers to express themselves, to communicate with other people and so on. A computer is no longer a work device, it's a social device. And if we really want to deliver the next phase of the benefits of free software, we have to get beyond thinking of the audience of our work as being a technical or developer audience. Now, that's not true of everybody. There are some people who don't agree with that, who say, well, free software is more interesting if it's just for technologists, if it's really advanced and really hard to use and so on. I don't agree with that at all. I think that's fine. But remember, there were already solutions in place for all of those people before Ubuntu came along. And so while we respect that position, we're interested in doing something different, which is bringing free software to hundreds of millions of people who might not even care that much about the underlying underpinnings of it. The reason I think that that's a useful goal, even for technologists, is that doing things well for consumers requires great technology, great discipline, and it's an interesting challenge. So I think in the process, by focusing on end users, we will actually produce software that is even better for developers, even better for technologists. It'll be even more reliable. Developers will be able to be even more productive. So I don't think the goals of Ubuntu, in other words, of being end-user focused, are antagonistic to the goals of developers in any way, shape, or form. Most of the developers that I work with every day are human beings. They don't, in fact, want to be bleeding all the time or on the bleeding edge. They want something that works, that's easy to use. They want something that they can share because that means that other people will have more insight into what they do. And of course, they want the ability to be on the bleeding edge in any given piece that is particularly interesting to them. So what are the things that we need to do differently if we want to go from being something that's appropriate for developers and technologists to something that's appropriate for a much larger audience, a much bigger audience? Let's see if this works. Well, one of the first things we need to do is we need to organize our work in a more structured kind of way. Historically, a lot of free software projects started out as sort of personal projects or projects within a company, and so they sort of followed their own schedule and their own pattern of delivery. But we've learned a couple of things in the last 10 years. One of them is that this idea of cadence, of delivering software on a regular structure, on a regular time basis, is a very powerful idea if you want to energize the whole community. You know, if you just focus on developers, then there's no real need to do a release because developers get satisfaction every day from developing the software. And if you just talk to developers, in many cases they'll say, look, releases are kind of boring for us because we have to change our mentality and we have to focus on different things at release time. If you talk to everybody else in a community, though, releases are really important. The people who do documentation find it very difficult to do their work if the software is changing all the time. It's much easier for them to dive in and actually be useful and constructive and feel empowered if they can focus on a release, if they know what they're going to have to document and when they're going to have to do it. All of the advocacy that happens around a project is best done, you know, when you have a release. A release creates an opportunity to talk about the software. It creates an opportunity to invite people to come and try the new features, try the new capabilities. The quality assurance work that happens, you know, you can attract people to a project to do quality, but it's much easier to do that if they have that feeling that they're testing something that is shortly going to be in the hands of end users. So projects which adopt a cadence find themselves energized on a much more regular basis. It's very interesting. In the last couple of years, we've seen the Linux kernel now pretty much on a rigorous 3-month cadence, you know, delivering a new kernel every 3 months. And if you look at that, it's starting to get into a TikTok where there's a more aggressive release and then a more conservative release and a more aggressive release and a more conservative release. That's making it much easier for the different distributions to collaborate with each other because we can look around and we can more or less agree on which version of the kernel we're each going to ship because all the distributions have started releasing on a cadence as well. We were the first to do that, but it's now a fairly common practice. So that makes it much easier to collaborate between distributions around the kernel because if we're all looking at the same base tree, then a fix. I think this is going to grow, this phenomenon is going to grow until almost every project has both a short release, a quick release where they make small changes, and a large-scale release where, for example, they break backwards compatibility. We're on a 6-month cadence with a 2-year cadence on top of that. So we go from what we call LTS release to LTS release every 2 years, and then every 6 months we're making a release. So that means every 4th release of Ubuntu is an LTS release. And that works very well for us. I think what you're going to see is projects like Genome and KDE, which are now comfortable in a 6-month cadence, starting to look at that larger cadence as well, because they have learned that if they don't have a large cycle as well as a small cycle, it's difficult to make the big changes that ultimately you do need to make every couple of years. If you don't have that, then they build up and build up and build up, and you get a very difficult transition in a major release. So I think cadence is very important, and we'll see a lot more of that. The next thing I think we need to embrace is this concept of design. Now, design is many different things. Surprisingly, though, it's a discipline. There's a lot of inspiration involved, just as there is in software engineering, in coding. But there's also a lot of rigor and science. So, for example, one of the things we've learned is that when we're starting to create new software or think about adding features to software, before we actually write any code, we should create some wireframes as to what we think users will see. And then we sit down with 5 or 6 users, that's all, doesn't need to be much more than that. And we ask them what they see on this wireframe, we look at where their attention goes and what they think they need to do to achieve a particular effect. And it's amazing how much you learn at that very early stage and what a significant impact that can have on your engineering thinking about how you're going to build what you're going to build. We now, within Canonical, we now integrate design into all of our engineering processes. And as a result, we're very confident that the free software we're producing is much more useful to many more people. And we spend less time going back and redoing things that we've already built because, you know, we build them and then find that they don't work. Within free software communities, this idea of design is becoming more attractive too. I think in part because of the web. You know, 10 years ago, most people's idea of software was Windows software. And it all looked a particular way and behaved in a particular way. But over the last 10 years, more and more people use software on the web every day, and every website looks different. The buttons aren't all the same. And so people have gotten more comfortable with the idea of innovating around design and the way software looks. And we've seen a lot of creative work. We've also learned that websites that are well designed do much better than websites that are badly designed. And we've started to learn you know, what it takes to create beauty and to give people a sense of immediate results. And so that web experience is now coming back and changing traditional software as well. In the free software community, though, there's often a culture of ownership by developers. So, for example, sometimes you'll talk to a developer who's been you know, leading a free software project for 5 years, and they'll say, "Well, I don't want to listen to somebody who doesn't know anything about software. You know, we do this because the development is interesting." And it takes some time to convince them that, in fact, if they work with people who are interested in design, who don't know anything about how the internals of the software work, sometimes, in fact, the engineering problems get more interesting. The best relationships I've seen are where the designers set engineers challenges. You know, the designers will say, "This is how it should look," and the first thing the engineer will say is, "That's not possible." And then they say, "Well, that's a really interesting challenge." And so I'm starting to see very healthy dynamics in some open source projects where designers have been invited in, they've been given respect, and essentially they're setting challenges for the engineers. I think that's a very healthy trend. And if we want to reach hundreds of millions of users, that's going to have to continue. Another area that I think we're going to have to change what we do is the field of quality. We tend to believe that free software is inherently better quality than commercial software, proprietary software. And when you test this, in fact, it turns out not always to be the case. By some metrics, yes, free software tends to do very well. By other metrics, it doesn't. In our business, we've started working more and more with companies that install software. You know, we want Ubuntu installed on PCs and shipped so that people can buy PCs with free software pre-installed. And the kinds of testing that they do on the hardware and the software are very different and more rigorous than the kinds of testing we see traditionally done in free software. So I think if we want to deliver consumer-grade software, we have to accept that we're going to have to learn some things about quality from the traditional software engineering world. In the best communities now, we're starting to see a very strong focus on rigorous testing, on automated testing. Now, it's very difficult to write software that tests itself. In fact, I think it requires a higher level of skill to write tests for software, automated tests, than it does to write the software in the first place. You can usually hire a developer who's got some experience with the language, and they can write code in that language. But it takes an extra couple of years of actually studying the language to then be able to set up test harnesses and create the frameworks for automated testing. So within Canonical, we're starting to recognize and reward people who have that skill more highly than new developers who are very bright and well qualified to write code, but actually don't yet understand how to write tests for their code. what I'd very much like to see is that the testing mentality become a standard part of how we ship software. You know, when you contribute a patch to a piece of software, that patch should come with a test suite that essentially verifies that the patch is doing what you said it would do, and which can be used by other people afterwards to make sure the changes they make to the code during maintenance or while they're adding new features don't break the functionality that you created. We spend a lot of time in free software essentially going backwards and fixing regressions, and we would do much less of that if we had rigorous testing at the heart of all of our free software. It also becomes a lot easier, for example, to support things like multiple architectures if you have a test suite. Often we know that software works pretty well on x86, but now we're interested in running that same software on ARM or on Power or on other architectures. We don't have as much confidence simply because there aren't as many people running it. But if we had more test suites, we would be able to put those architectures benchmark them against one another, both in terms of quality and in terms of performance. And I think that would be very useful as free software makes the shift from being PC-centric to being sort of a universal platform. If we're going to become the de facto standard way that people do software, we're going to need to change the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about the rest of the software ecosystem. You know, for many years, we have grown almost as a rebel force, you know, like the little rebels striking back against the evil empire. And that's a very good way to motivate people to take on a challenge. And it served us very well. But in fact, we're starting to get to the point where we need to be a little more organized than a rebel force or a revolutionary council usually is. What's that?
Build a republic.
Yeah, we need to build a republic. And that means also recognizing in a republic that in fact there needs to be a little bit of room for everybody else as well. It's not about fighting a war. I just finished 2 weeks in Budapest. The last week was UDS, our sort of contributor summit. And I was in one talk where, you know, there was some language about, you know, a bloodbath and, you know, it was a big fight and a battle. And I said, look, calm down, everybody. This is, you know, we're not fighting a war here. No one's going to die, right? We're trying to show that, in fact, this is a better way to produce software. If it is a better way to produce software, then our way will win. We don't need to think of ourselves as full of adrenaline and, you know, fighting a hostile battle. In particular, we need to develop more sophisticated relationships with companies that span the range from open source to proprietary. We need to recognize that it's important to let people and to support people running proprietary software on free software, right? And this is a big thing for us with Ubuntu. We want Ubuntu to be a free software platform. We also want it to be a platform where people can run the software that they need to run, even if that happens to be proprietary. And that's controversial. People, you know, who think of this as a rebellion, as a revolution, are very uncomfortable with that idea. But I don't believe we will ever get to a world where free software is the only way of doing things. And so I don't think it's constructive to have a hostile relationship with companies that span the boundaries. Sure, I think free software is a better way of doing things, and I think more and more companies will do more and more software as free software. The best way to do that is to entice them in, to become extremely valuable to them, to make them realize that the contributions and participation that we offer are actually really valuable to them, and that the more open they are, the more of that they will get. But at the moment, we're in this weird situation where, you know, if you think of this game as a battlefield, there are companies that are on the other side of the lines, right? Those are the proprietary software companies, and they stay proprietary, and we never really talk about them, you know. Then there are groups that are completely on this side of the lines. The worst place to be is in the middle, in the no man's land. If you're in the no man's land over there, then everybody shoots at you. And from our perspective, I think that's a bad thing, because most of the world's software economy, most of the world's software investment is on the other side of the lines in the proprietary world. And we need to figure out how to encourage those companies to start walking across no man's land. We won't achieve that if any time a company does a little bit of open source, they become the focus of really hostile and aggressive criticism for all the pieces that they're not doing as open source, or for all the ways in which we disagree with pieces or parts of what they do. And I've talked to lots of companies who say this. They say they've started doing bits of open source, but it's really uncomfortable. They suddenly become the target of large amounts of very negative criticism, very negative hostility. I think to a certain extent, this is also true internally within the open source community, right? We love to criticize each other, right? We love to criticize each other. And nobody's perfect. The FSF is criticizing Debian. Debian's rejecting the GFDL from the FSF. The FSF guys resent the OSI. The OSI think the FSI, it goes on and on and on. And, each company has something that they've done wrong that somebody doesn't like. The reality is, we're human beings. So we all have opinions about everything. And the chances of finding another large group of people with whom you agree entirely, or the chances of getting two large groups of people to agree entirely, right, is non-existent. When we make the focus of our discussions and conversations our differences, we're effectively undermining ourselves. Again, I think the world is in transition. I think it is in a shift towards free software. I think we would accelerate that if we essentially accepted that there are always going to be a diversity of opinions along the way, and didn't take so much pleasure and satisfaction out of beating up on each other. The last thing I think we need to be, and it goes hand in hand with this idea of living in a more complex, heterogeneous, diverse world, we need to accept that there are going to be lots of new and interesting business models that build up around free software. That's good because it means that there will be more and more jobs for people who have expertise in free software. But it's absolutely clear that there will be business models in there that we dislike as much potentially as we dislike proprietary software licensing. Again, I think we need to keep our eye on the ball, and that is that we need to be figuring out how to get more and more software into the digital commons under accepted open source licenses. I don't think we should get distracted by the business model changes that will spring up around it. There is going to be a lot of innovation and a lot of creativity in business models. We need to figure out how to carry that forward. So right now, for example, the companies that are spreading free software most widely are companies like Google, who have advertising-based business models. And as much as we might dislike that, the reality is they are carrying Linux dramatically forward. They are also carrying other licenses, other software under like Apache-style licenses forward dramatically. Now, I know there are a lot of people in the GNU Linux camp who look at Android and say, that's not Linux the way we like Linux. That's true. But then if we feel that strongly, we need to come up, and I say we because I feel myself more or less in the GNU camp rather than in the Android camp. We need to figure out how to get investment into the GNU Linux stack. And we won't do that unless we become more tolerant, unless we become more accepting of the priorities and the constraints that companies have to operate under. So those are the things that I think are important. The opportunity for us is tremendous. The opportunity is to look forward 5 years to a world where you can go into a store and get a computer that has free software preloaded and that comes with the freedoms that developers have historically, or over the last 15 years, I think, taken somewhat for granted. It won't be very easy. There are challenges ahead of us that I would characterize more as social challenges rather than technical challenges. We know that our technology is great. We know that we can produce, that we can innovate, and that we can solve hard problems. But the hardest problems to solve are social problems. Anyway, that's why I think Linux user groups like this one are so important, because they are essentially social forums for people who have different perspectives, but a common sort of broad interest. And I think they play a very important role as a result. Anyway, I hope that was useful. Those of you who are running Ubuntu and the recent release of Ubuntu will have seen the efforts that we're making to move beyond the user interfaces of the past and to build software that you really can share with your friends. I think we're playing something of a leadership role in that, but there are other communities that are starting to adopt the same sorts of goals, and I think that's very healthy. I would like the language between all of our communities to be constructive and collaborative, but we do compete. We compete around ideas. We compete for users. Managing that competition, I think, is really important, and it has to be done at every level. It has to be a value that we all share if we want to get the most of that for ourselves and for our users. Is there opportunity to take some questions? Is that? Yeah, I don't know. Answering questions is much easier for me because then I know at least one person's. Sure, okay. Yeah, hello.
Well, maybe I can ask. Well, does giving something for free makes it difficult to compete with those who give something for money, because they have much more money for marketing and everything else? So is it possible to compete and
right.
help?
So the question is, how will software that is generally free of charge compete with software that is proprietary? It's certainly true that the business models around free software are much leaner. They have much lower margins in them than the traditional proprietary licensing business models. The flip side is that once you establish some sort of sustainability, as a few companies in open source have done, it becomes very difficult for the other side to compete with you, because you can undercut them economically. It's much harder to grow up than it is to scale down. So I think companies that have historically had very high software margins will find it very difficult to compete with open source once new business models give some sort of sustainability to open source. I think the shift that we're seeing is away from licensing to services of various forms, either professional services or legal services, assurance, other kinds of services. And those business models all have much lower margins in them than proprietary software. The flip side is the cost of production of open source is much lower than the cost of production of proprietary software. We don't have to do everything for ourselves every time. We can leverage one another's work. And we don't have to carry all of the costs of innovation. If you have an idea for a new feature in the web browser, inside Microsoft, you have to get that idea approved by lots of people. And Microsoft has to choose the best features to add very early so they can concentrate their bets, whereas we don't. We have lots of communities innovating all the time, and we can very quickly pull in innovation that's successful. So I think we can compete. What's weak at the moment is that we haven't yet fully fleshed out all of the other business models. I think Google obviously is in a strong position, and Android is working well for them. Also, of course, they're in a strong position in the web, where they keep the free software on the server. So we'll see how that goes. You had a question over there, yeah.
Yes. Well, I might add something to this about the software price and its freedom. It's not necessarily it's one or the other. You can sell things that people can get for free because you give them support, you give them installation. No one will just take very little companies will take some software and just do it themselves, install and teach their people how to use it. There is much more money in services like support and education verification and installation and making modifications for customer than it is in just selling the license to use the software. But my question was about you talked about the opportunities working with proprietary software companies and such. There is also a risk. Of course, there are opportunities, but sometimes companies release there is the open core model we've heard of, or things like that, which are kind of open source and kind of free software, but they're actually made to entangle you and to subvert the idea of free software and to lock you up later. So I think that people should be wary of that, and for that they need to be educated on what things are good and what companies are really trying to get into this open source thing, and which are just trying to get them to their side and then close them again later.
Right, so the question or observation was about the risks of collaborating with proprietary software companies. And the observation is that sometimes when companies are operating in that no man's land, they do things like open core models or dual licensing models. My own view is that all of those models are better for free software than the alternative, which is having the company on the other side of the fence and having nothing in the middle. And in fact, I think we should engage with companies even where we don't trust them, even where we know that they will abuse what trust we put in them, even where we know that the work that we do will help them with an agenda that isn't useful to us. And that's quite a shocking statement to a lot of people. The reality is that companies bring a very substantial amount of complementary discipline to the coding, which is so central to free software. They also bring, they also essentially bring full-time development capacity and development capacity that goes beyond individual interests. If you look at the projects which span these divides, they're often very controversial. For example, Qt, the toolkit, it was dual licensed for a very long time. And that made it the target of a lot of criticism, because people said, well, if you contribute to Qt, you're helping this company which sells that software. The reality is, the flip side is also true. That company is giving their contributions to everybody else under the GPL. And I don't think there's enough appreciation from the free software community as to the scale of the contribution that companies actually make. And this comes from the sort of view that the only value here is the free software value, right? And so, and which we tend to take for granted because we think that it's given on the same terms. But actually, in many cases, real value gets added by having all of the other things that companies bring. I was talking to someone from the LibreOffice project. If you know, there was a proprietary company that had StarOffice. That was acquired by Sun, which then open sourced it, and they had a dual licensing model where you could still get StarOffice under commercial terms, but you could also get OpenOffice. And this became controversial because in order to maintain that model, they needed contributions to be given to them so that they could then also put them into StarOffice. And a very strong, hostile community grew up attacking this practice of Sun's. And I think that's been very unfortunate. First of all, I don't think free software community really appreciated the fact that Sun took a $100 million investment, proprietary investment, and published it under the LGPL. So we all get all of that code under the LGPL. That's an enormous contribution to free software. In return, I think it's reasonable that they should be able to experiment with different business models, one of which is dual licensing. If you look at what Richard Stallman says about dual licensing, he says, look, it's not ideal. We'd prefer a world where all the software is free software. But if this is a model which essentially allows us to take substantial contributions from companies, we should focus on the fact that the free software core is growing much faster. because that is our goal, right? We want to grow the base of software that's under free software licensing. So Stallman is quite pragmatic about this dual licensing practice. Anyway, Sun then got bought by Oracle, which is a rapacious and can be quite a nasty company to deal with on, commercially. But we shouldn't forget Oracle underwrites a lot of Linux development. Btrfs, the next generation file system that we all hope to use, is essentially an Oracle development. They have big guns. It's silly for us, to fight those guns. It would be better for us, essentially, whenever possible, to get those guns aligned with our goals. Anyway, this very factional conversation between OpenOffice and LibreOffice ultimately resulted in Oracle saying, you know what, we're just going to shut OpenOffice down. Perhaps more tragically, I think, because this situation had become so contentious, Oracle tried to get other companies to see if they would take on the responsibilities of OpenOffice, and no company wanted to do it. Essentially, that would be starting a company in no man's land with all of these guns trained on you. Microsoft's guns from the one side and the free software community's guns from the other side. This is not a happy proposition. So when Oracle shut this down, there were quite a lot of self-congratulatory messages within the LibreOffice community. We won. And I think that it's perhaps early to reach that conclusion. I was talking to one of the LibreOffice developers, and I said, well, are you going to miss Oracle's contributions? And he said, no. And I said, well, they had 100 people working on OpenOffice. And he said, well, yes, but only 30 of them were developers. The other 70 were doing things like documentation and QA. And I find that a very short-sighted approach. The reality is, if we want to make great software, we need documentation and we need QA. How many times have you been inside a free software community and people have said, oh, man, we really need people to write documentation. We really need people to do QA, right? The reality is that it's difficult to attract developers. It's difficult to attract people to those roles within a free software project. If it's just a free software project. It's much easier to get that kind of contribution from a company that has a long-term interest in the product and potentially selling products based on that. So my view on this is that really we need to think very carefully about what kind of revolutionaries we really want to be, right? That doesn't mean we have to compromise our principles, but it means that potentially we need to have a slightly more respectful engagement with the people who span the worlds. Yeah.
I think I have a very topical question after your ceasefire. What can you say about switching away from Genome, especially about criticism that Canonical is making documented here syndrome with it, and the potential harm for the Genome project because one of the major distributors is shipping Genome.
Of course I use Unity. Of course I use Unity personally. All right, I'll come to your question next, but this is a very interesting one. So if you talk to GNOME developers, most developers of applications that are associated with GNOME have historically been of the view that GNOME is an open platform. And so, it's a loose coalition of people who use GTK and gObject and glib as sort of common core technologies. But there are multiple companies participating, and it's always had a certain amount of diversity in the platform. That was necessary, in fact, to attract lots of different companies to the project in the first place. Remember, GNOME was set up by Symbian, Sun, Red Hat, and a couple of other companies which don't exist anymore, right? It's also interesting to remember that it was set up largely because of hostility towards Qt and Trolltech and the licensing around Qt, which it was open source, but it wasn't free software at the time. It is now. It was also set up, and quite pointedly set up using the LGPL rather than the GPL as its sort of core license, because they wanted to attract to GNOME, they wanted to attract proprietary software developers as well. And it's very easy to forget that now, but those were the key driving forces of how GNOME was set up. And for the longest time, GNOME has been a platform that you can use and which you're encouraged to use to build your own software around and to innovate around. We have multiple music players in GNOME. That's not a problem. We have multiple ways to do lots of things. They share these sort of core technology values. A couple of years back, we started to do more and more work with companies. And they wanted us to build custom interfaces for GNOME, essentially, for their netbooks. And we convinced a couple of those companies to let us concentrate our efforts and build what became the Ubuntu Netbook Remix interface. And that was clearly, we built it as a GNOME interface, and it was used in many places as a GNOME interface. When we started participating in the GNOME shell design discussions, we saw the direction they were going in, and we had different ideas, and we discussed those with the designers. Some of the ideas they said they were interested in, some they said they weren't. And the net effect was that we felt it would still be worthwhile for us to essentially do the next generation of the netbook interface, which is what became Unity today. And if you look at the history of GNOME Shell and the mock-ups and the code itself, Unity and GNOME Shell actually looked very, very different throughout about 2 years of development. It was only after we were shipping Unity as a product that the GNOME Shell design rapidly changed to look much more like the Unity design today. So I think that's something of a pity, because I think GNOME could have had two different interfaces for different kinds of audiences or different kinds of users, but essentially now you have two that are quite similar. Nevertheless, we always built Unity with a view that it would be part of the GNOME project, and if you talk to a lot of GNOME developers, that's a perfectly reasonable position to have taken. So in our mind, this was never a question of diverging from GNOME or dropping GNOME. In the last couple of months, there's a group within GNOME that has started to say, no, GNOME should define the whole stack. It should essentially be what they call GNOME OS. And every distribution should be required to ship exactly that stack from top to bottom. And there are good reasons for making that argument, because potentially you make it easier for developers because they know exactly what's there. You also make it much more difficult for the distributions, because it would be extremely difficult to fit into that. And I think if you look at the history of GNOME, it would have been very difficult to actually create GNOME with that philosophy in the first place. Anyway, there's now a very big discussion within the GNOME community itself as to which way they want to go. Do they want to be a platform? In which case, we continue to see Unity as part of GNOME, and we continue to see our default interface as a GNOME environment. We took a lot of technological decisions to stay in what we see as the constraints that define GNOME. Or if the GNOME community decides to narrow its definition and say, no, GNOME is not a platform, it's a product, and it must always look like this, then obviously that leaves us in a difficult position, because we're not going to ship that product. If that happens, I would say this. Ubuntu has always been bigger than Ubuntu Desktop, if you know what I mean. So we have Kubuntu, we have Lubuntu, we have Xubuntu, the XFCE-based interface. And there will always be a home for pure GNOME, essentially, or as close as we can come to that, inside the Ubuntu archives. I would hope that developers and GNOME users can always get that experience within Ubuntu. So I know that this is being characterized as a decision to sort of drop GNOME and move off in a different direction, but that's simply not how it came about, or what our intent was, or potentially what the future looks like either. Essentially, though, it was probably presumptuous of me and of us, of the Unity team, to think that we could assume that GNOME would embrace our work just because that had happened before. And now we find ourselves in this interesting position. But we'll see.
Also, it may be worthy because I'm trying to get Unity into Debian, and it might be worthy noting that GNOME is starting to be the platform that is by developer for developer, and Unity can actually bring it to new masses. So that's the thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, we are seeing very encouraging signs of Unity being packaged for Debian, for OpenSUSE, for Fedora as well. You know, we very much would encourage that. It's free software for a reason. You had a question over here.
You spoke about business models and how it creates such a slim line for those companies to actually making money. Why don't we see more of this happening in the public sector? I'm curious if the business models or profit margins are not such concerns in the public sector, so why don't we see open source?
So the question is why we aren't seeing more adoption of open source in the public sector. The answer is twofold. First, the public sector is adopting open source, and very rapidly. We've seen the largest deployments of Ubuntu typically being public sector deployments. In some cases, hundreds of thousands of machines going to FreeSoft, going to Ubuntu. Typically starting in places like education, but also moving to other services, security services, and sort of administrative services as well. The handbrakes are first compatibility with Microsoft Office and other proprietary tools. And this is why I think it's important that we realize that if we actually want to be more relevant to a wider audience, we have to be more tolerant and more willing to be interoperable, right? Because we'll make faster progress that way, right? It's not about helping the bad guys. It's about smoothing the path of adoption of our stuff in places where it's not good or bad, it's just software, right? The other issue, of course, is that there are very deep relationships between buyers and sellers, and it takes time for new entrants that are selling new stuff, essentially, to enter that. But we have seen very encouraging signs. The economics of free software are much better for users, both industrial users and government users. Economic pressures in Europe, for example, have led to acceleration of adoption of open source software, which is really encouraging. Interestingly, government usage is being led in Europe, whereas corporate usage of free software is being led from the States. Yeah. Right. So the observation or question was about the risks of trying to be compatible with a hostile de facto standard, particularly the Office format standard. I think everyone was pretty disgusted by the way in which Microsoft handled the international standards process around their own file formats and hostility towards an open standard. Nevertheless, in Europe, for example, we see quite widespread recognition of open data formats as an important issue, and some constructive presence. I think the interoperability story is probably getting better just because Microsoft's ability to innovate against its own legacy is slowing down. Right? They can't isolate their own legacy users. And we should play that. I think we should aim for interoperability, even though it is a difficult goal. On the intellectual property front, I do see software patents as a massive source of friction and essentially a threat to not just to free software, but to the opportunities that free software presents for the rest of the world. A patent. Historically, if you go back a couple of hundred years, businesses would keep secrets. So, you had the glass blowers in Venice who kept as a trade secret how they would make that glass. And the glass would get shipped across the Adriatic here, and it would be a precious commodity because no one knew how they could make it. These ships would come over with this amazing glass, and no one could figure out how to make it. So you'd have families that for generations would keep secrets. And the idea of patents was actually to accelerate innovation. Right? The problem for a family that had a trade secret was that all it took was one person to talk or one person to reverse engineer it, and now suddenly you'd completely lost your competitive advantage. So you were always unsure about where you stood. So patents were introduced as a way of saying, well, let's give companies the reassurance of companies, families, whatever, the reassurance of a monopoly for a while in exchange for the disclosure. Because as we know from academia, when one scientist has an idea and publishes a paper, and completely different scientists will often see that idea and then take it a step further. And that's very healthy, that's very vibrant. So patents essentially are a way of getting these secrets out into the open and providing a compensation to the people whose secrets they were. So, and that actually works quite well in fields where you can keep secrets, right? It speeds things up for society in places where you can keep secrets. The problem is that today we've gotten carried away, and so we keep trying to extend patents to things that you couldn't keep secret. And we should go back, I think, to remember the original idea. The original idea is about accelerating the benefits of knowledge and science to all of society. Well, science will happen regardless. People do research because they're solving problems that are in front of them. And that happens regardless. It's not the existence of patents that makes people do science and makes people do research. So what we should do is we should make sure that we don't allow patents on anything that you couldn't realistically keep a secret. And software is one of those things. There are lots of other things, mathematical formulas and so on and so forth. We should never, business processes, we should never allow patents on that. They just slow society down. And as you say, the level of patent hostility towards Android is a sign of how the old industries are trying to stop change. We see the same thing in the music industry, where the old middlemen who are no longer needed. You don't need a record company either to make music or to sell music or to listen to music. There's no distribution that can beat the internet. So we always see this. You see old companies trying to use intellectual property rules to slow down change in an industry, and we shouldn't stand for that here. There are some countries that are starting to say, for example, that patents don't apply to open source software, or patents can't be used against open source software, on the basis that patents are an argument about public good, and the view is that open source is a better public good than a patent. So I think we will start to see some movement in that regard, but it's worth fighting for. We can't take it for granted. Any other questions? Here. So the question is about plans for supporting alternative architectures. Historically, Linux has supported lots of architectures quite well. I think Debian is ported to, what, 13? They may have dropped some recently, but at one stage, Debian ran on 13 architectures, which is incredible. Yeah, now 12. And I think that's one of the great strengths of free software. In order to provide support at the level that, say, Ubuntu or Red Hat are supported, there's quite a substantial amount of cost. So relatively few architectures, I think, can support that level of investment. Historically, x86 obviously has. I think we're starting to see ARM, certainly for sort of client devices, but possibly also for the server. We're starting to see ARM as an architecture get to a point where there's enough Linux on ARM happening now that potentially you'll see ARM become more formally supported. And I wouldn't be surprised if other, some of the big old architectures make a comeback, because that's the nature of life. You see, things go in circles, and so perhaps some other architectures make a comeback as well. But I've no specific, news in that regard.
I'd like to hear your opinion about business models relating to open source. And basically, I have this feeling that generally in open source, it's hard to build a scalable business model. So if because the traditional open source business models like support and training and stuff like that, if you want to make 10 times as much money, you need 10 times as many people.
Right.
So apart from advertising that you mentioned, what do you think are some of the
Sure.
features?
So the question is about business models associated with open source, and the observation, which I think is very astute, is that things like support are very difficult to scale. It's difficult to scale up when your business is growing because you've got to hire people at a time usually when everybody else is trying to hire people. And then when you have a recession or when your business gets hit, you have to scale down, and letting people go is even more difficult than hiring them in the first place. So I think that's a very astute observation. I think the internet allows us to look at service business models that don't necessarily scale as badly as traditional professional services, professional support services did. You don't necessarily have to send someone in a suit out to your customer, to bill for those extra services. So companies, like Dell, are experimenting with entering into the services game, providing professional services, but doing it on a remote basis, and based on their knowledge of the hardware and the software, and the configuration and so on. And I think that really is the key, is looking for service business models which scale if we want to go beyond advertising. There are other business models that are obviously more device-oriented. Apple sells quite a lot of devices with free software kernels and so on, right? Their business model is much more tightly tied, on the one hand, to the hardware, and on the other hand, to services like iTunes, which scales. iTunes is not free software, but it's, I guess, bezplatna would be the, I don't know if that's an expression, but unpaid. And so that suggests that there are possibilities in that regard as well. But it will be difficult. There will be experimentation around that. I don't think we'll like all of it, but at the end of the day, I think if we want free software to grow, we'll need to find ways to channel investment to it. The current model for free software for GNU Linux is quite weak. Currently, because there are it's very difficult if you're a buyer of something that's part of the GNU Linux stack. For example, if you really want Apache, or you really want telepathy or LibreOffice, that's what your key requirement is. It's quite difficult to actually build a relationship with that project. Projects are very weak institutionally, right? You can't have a sales conversation with them. You can't have a legal conversation with them. It's difficult. You can have a legal conversation with them if you want to talk about the differences between BSD and GPL, or GPL2 and GPLv3. That's the extent of the legal conversations we can do, right? We can't have legal conversations about jurisdictions and assurances and service levels and payment terms, right? So as a result, because the components are weak, the aggregators are strong. So if you think about it, the money in open source today in the GNU Linux world goes to the distributions. So it goes to Red Hat, Novell, Canonical, mostly, right? I think that's not very good. And it's strange that I would say that because, Canonical is growing as an aggregator. It's growing as an aggregator in scope and scale and stature, and therefore its revenues will grow. The problem is if all the money comes into just a few gates and those companies then decide where they will place the investments on the back end, you don't have a lot of creativity. You don't have a lot of innovation. There's only so much innovation any one company can produce because ideas compete for them for oxygen internally, right? We've seen this at Microsoft. So I don't think a world where all the power rests with the distributions is very good for free software at all. And I know it's weird for me to say that, because Canonical is a distribution. But I'm looking beyond the current status of free software. And I say, right, if we want to compete with Android, compete with iOS, compete with Windows, compete with macOS, we need a whole ecosystem that is as powerful and as innovative as their ecosystems. And their ecosystems have a lot of powerful entities other than the anchor tenants, right? Other than Microsoft, other than Apple, other than Google. So that's why I believe that we should encourage companies to own pieces of free software because it will channel more resources to those components create more competition between the companies and the components. The net effect will be that the distributions get better because the components get better. The distributions get a little weaker as a result. Now, that's obviously not a popular view amongst the distributions, right? Because why would you do that? But if you look beyond the success today, I think we need to have strong companies. I'd like to see a company behind LibreOffice, right? We had one in OpenOffice, and I think we shot ourselves in the foot a little bit. But I think it would be good if companies that want to deploy free software on 10,000 desktops, not because they want an open source operating system, but because they actually want open source word processing, if they could get that directly from the company. And so I think, in fact, we've made a miscalculation in a lot of our ideology and dogma in the free software community. Yeah. Sure. So examples of large-scale deployments, the very well-known ones in Spain, I think 7 out of 9 provinces use open source exclusively for all of their educational infrastructure. So every school has computer laboratories. They're all running GNU Linux. I think 7 of the 9 are based on Ubuntu. 1 is based on Debian and, yeah, Extremadura. And then 1 is different, and I'm not sure exactly what they do. Macedonia just deployed, I think, 120,000 seats. They did a clever thing. They had, I think, 30,000 computers, but they used technology to put multiple keyboards and monitors around one computer, so they could get very, very low-cost computing. Average cost per seat, incredibly low in Macedonia. France, the police force in France has moved almost entirely now to free software. That was a 7-year project. It started out with Firefox and OpenOffice, and then moved to, I think, Mail, and then they started moving the operating system. So again, recognizing that for large institutions, these migrations will take years, and for most of that time, they will actually be in a hybrid environment. I think that's very important to realize. Munich, the famous migration at Munich, really struggled because they set a very aggressive schedule. They said, we're just going to move everything, and we're going to build our own desktop operating system in the process. That clearly wasn't an effective plan because it's taken them sort of 8 or 9 years. But they are now, I believe, making progress. They're using Kubuntu, and then they've got their own layer on top of that. So, oh gosh, what are other examples? Really? Well, Bosnia after DebConf, we're going to have, what, 1,000 Debian hackers in Bosnia. We can change the world. Yeah. So those sorts of scale. In India right now, there's a pilot of 4,000 that looks like it will go to a deployment of 110,000. That's a government project. So very large scale deployments. Oh, sure, sorry. What the preconditions? Right. So the things that those sorts of deployments depend on, first they depend on an economic advantage. So they need to become comfortable with the idea that, in fact, this is going to save them money, genuinely and measurably. They also often depend on a manageability and security advantage. They need to sort of believe that by doing this, they make their infrastructure more resilient, more manageable, so that they can spend less time, fighting fires and more time adding value, adding applications. They're often dependent or associated with a move to the web. So those institutions are moving their internal software from Visual Basic on Windows or .NET to the web, where they're delivering the software through the web. And so that makes the transition easier. Yeah, those are sort of common patterns in all of those. There are many problems in the free software stack today for those institutions. Those large deployments, have to solve a lot of interesting problems along the way. They, the software that we have is limited in many regards. The ability to lock down desktops, the ability to specify desktop configurations within certain ranges, to handle authentication in a heterogeneous environment is always challenging. And solving those problems, as we solve them for each user, the barriers to adoption become lowered elsewhere. It's going to be very interesting. The future may be an Android future. I mean, it's very interesting. If I look at the competition for GNU Linux on the desktop, the two major challenges, I think, both come from Google. I admire Google greatly, and it is an interesting relationship that we have with them. Android, could well become more of a desktop environment, and Chrome OS, obviously, putting everything, in the browser. I'm a little daunted at the prospect of a world where Google literally knows everything. Any data you create, any history that you create. But I think that would be a very efficient world from a manageability point of view. So it's going to have its economic advantages as well. And I think that this is the sort of competition that stimulates investment. Can we, in GNU Linux, deliver the benefits of that lightweight computing experience without some of the risks associated with, the centralization of so much data? Much as I admire and respect Google. Question at the back. So we see some very interesting. Android has its strengths. The Android team has done a very good job, targeting the form factors that they've targeted. And clearly, there's no effective competition based on Ubuntu or on GNU Linux, if you want to generalize it, for the phone form factor or for the tablet form factor at this stage. We have. In GNU Linux, we have to think there are a lot of problems for us to solve if we want to be relevant there. We have to solve problems around power management. We have to solve problems around security. We have to solve problems around user experience. And we have to solve problems around footprint, the size of the image and the sort of update model experience. I think those problems are solvable, and there are lots of companies working on them. We are starting to see interesting hybrid environments. There's a phone, for example, called the Motorola Atrix, which has both Android and Ubuntu on it. And when you dock it, you get an Ubuntu desktop, and when you undock it, you've got an Android phone. It's quite a cool idea. And we're doing a lot of work. We have a team which is partly Canonical, partly ARM, and partly other people in the ARM industry. And they're doing a lot of work around both the GNU Linux stack and the Android stack. So it's very difficult to predict what might come out of that. You're creating a space where there's a lot of focused attention around both stacks, and then you look for opportunities that come from that. There isn't anything immediately obvious yet, but I always find that cultures and countries and nations and cities that are at intersection points always seem to be very vibrant places, right? It's always interesting to go to the city which has the most immigrants, because that's the city where you get the most diversity of everything, really. And so I think of that project as essentially that. It's like a crucible bringing together these different worlds of GNU Linux and Android. Right. So the question is about, again, business models around open source software, and specifically app stores and cross-distribution compatibility. So I think there's some really interesting points in there. First, I think we can learn a lot from the App Store. That's the first thing. It's irritating sometimes to be asked, I don't know what it would be like, 20 kuna or 30 kuna for a piece of software. But the flip side is it's generated a lot of investment. It's created a lot of opportunities for small developers. If you look at the software industry, in the rest of the software industry, you've seen this consolidation. So you have these big companies buying up more and more software. So software is owned by fewer and fewer companies. And then if you look at the App Store world, you've got hundreds, thousands of very small development shops generating a lot of innovation, a lot of ideas, a lot of beautiful software. So I think there's lots that we can learn from that. In Ubuntu, we have something called the Software Center, which is essentially an app store. We do publish software in there. At the moment, you can buy proprietary software, and I think you will be able to donate to the projects that make free software, which is something that we've wanted to have for a long time, and we now will have a very direct ability for people to say, I'm using this software. We'll need to do some work so that you can see which software you use the most and say, okay, I want to donate to that. But I feel very good that we'll have that capability. There are discussions about doing that, creating that across multiple distributions. The challenges, and I think it's possible, the challenges there come in things like packaging formats, which differ, and I think they differ needlessly. 10 years ago, there was reasonable competition and innovation happening around packaging formats. There isn't really today. Certainly nothing that warrants the level of fragmentation that we do have. So that's one of the set of problems we have. Even when we get packaging right, again, we'll have to come back, I think, and solve the cadence problem. I think all the distributions should sit down every 6 months and say, okay, this is the kernel we'll use, this is the X we'll use, this is, and go through the stack. And if we do that predictably, we get to the point where we're essentially running the same stack down to the point version from top to bottom. Now, that's a terrifying thought for some distributions, because they say, well, our ability to innovate or our ability to differentiate will be destroyed. But I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think any significant number of people choose a distribution because of the point version of libxml that they use. But that point version difference can make a huge difference for developers targeting GNU Linux. From our perspective, we're humble about this. We don't care, you know what I mean? We'd much rather be collaborating around a common version than trying to differentiate on point releases. And traditionally, Ubuntu has been the beneficiary of that because we have this faster release cycle, right? Typically, we have newer versions of stuff. But in fact, we'd be quite happy to collaborate with others. Debian, we've long offered to get into a release cadence with Debian, and of course the other distros as well. If you get all of those things right, then potentially we could get to a point where a developer can simply target a standard GNU Linux and deliver their software through a standard app store. Now, a more controversial question is what should be the case for free software that is available only for money in an app store. Now, that sounds shocking because we associate so strongly the free of charge piece with the freedom piece. We always find ourselves having to say, it's not just free of charge, it's this. We take the free of charge piece for granted. Imagine flipping that around. And this exact example came up in the Apple App Store, where developers published GPL software into the Apple App Store. In fact, in a way that is compliant with the GPL, because you can still get the source code, and you can participate and you contribute. It created a storm of controversy. And I think this is one of the things where we need to be honest with ourselves. When we say it's all about freedom, not about free of charge, we need to be willing to stand by that in the cases where, in fact, it could be different. We have no plans in Ubuntu to charge for GPL applications. But this is the sort of thing I think we should be willing to explore and not have a knee-jerk reaction against. In that case, I think it was Battle for Wesnoff. It's a really interesting game. And I don't know what the resolution with that is. I don't know whether Apple kicked it out because they didn't want the fight or what the story was. But for a while, it looked like, in fact, we would have a viable model for channeling quite a lot of funds to an open source project, which for developers preserves all of their rights, and for end users, essentially, just looks like great software. So a very interesting dynamic. And again, the sort of thing that can easily generate vicious knee-jerk reactions, but should actually stimulate us to think about what's ultimately best, and potentially to be willing to let that experiment run for a while. Question here.
I have a question actually concerning the user base that is growing. So what if when the user base grows from, let's say, several million users to several tens of millions of users and hundreds of millions of users, how does that change Ubuntu and how does this change Canonical?
So the question is about scale, about how we can deal with scale if we go from millions of users to tens and hundreds of millions of users. In order to do that, we have to change some of our practices, particularly around quality. We can't have the same relationship with 100 million users as we do with 1 million users. That's absolutely clear. And we can't deliver the same product either. So there'll be some people in that initial million who feel let down, right? But I think the cause of free software is enhanced if we're willing to try to make that transition. And ultimately, again, even the most hardcore developers that I know are not interested in developing every piece of their system equally. They actually want a consumer-grade free software platform. And then they want the ability to put today's Apache on it, or today's kernel, or today's whatever they're interested in, right? And that's where I think we can get to. Maybe we can take one last question, because I fear we'll be delaying proceedings. Over here.
Business question. Do you think it's important to have a regional office, like Cisco or Microsoft, whatever? That is important for that region, country, whatever, to have support for the smaller companies that will sell the product.
Right. So the question is whether regional offices are important and necessary. I think they can help if your goal is to engage, for example, with local businesses or with government. Again, my view of the future is a little bit different. It's not so much based on the view of the past. I don't think that in future Canonical will be of the scale of an Oracle and have lots of offices and lots of places and have to. In fact, I'd much rather that there were local businesses that were serving the local market and doing so in a way that is probably better than a global company can. We need to figure out how to make, how to make Canonical sustainable. It doesn't make money today, and so figuring out the relationship between local and global is interesting. But I'd much rather that you were creating competence and expertise locally. In some cases, we've seen places where, for example, we have local companies that have taken Ubuntu and then they paint over it, they change the name and they call it, local Linux. And I think that's okay. As a starting point, it helps them get up over the ramp. It then becomes very difficult for them to grow beyond a certain point, because beyond an initial core audience, people are very aware of that whole dynamic and actually want Ubuntu. So we don't discourage that, because our experience is that usually helps companies get to the point where they can establish local relationships and so on. And then sooner or later, we start talking to them about some sort of commercial relationship. And they realize that they're better off being able to offer a global solution. If you Google for how to make your printer work with local Linux X, you may not get an answer. Whereas Googling for getting a solution for that with Red Hat or with Ubuntu or with Debian, you're more likely to get a solution, particularly with Ubuntu. Anyway, thank you very much. It was very enjoyable to be here.